Okay, we'll go ahead and get started.
Hi, everybody. This is Raymond Dehn. I want to take a moment and just welcome everybody to our session today. And in a moment, we'll have some great conversations about what reimagining services in prisons look like. We are going to start by some introductions, but before I get to that, I want to make sure that folks realize that, and of course, I want to thank the Minnesota Justice Research Center for hosting the conference. And if you haven't had a chance yet to make a contribution, today is Give to the Max Day, but please go to MNJRC and make your contribution today. Just a quick outline of what we're going to do today. We're going to have a little bit of introductions from our panelists, a great group of panelists that we have, and then we're going to go into some prepared question and answers, and hopefully we will get some great questions and answers from folks out watching today. So as I mentioned, my name is Raymond Dehn. I'm currently a state representative. I'm completing my fourth term in the Minnesota legislature. It's been an incredible honor to serve the people of my district here at the legislature. And I want to say it's going to be exciting to see what comes next. But in the meantime, while I was there, I had a great set of experiences, including working on committees like the Public Safety Committee, the Capital Investment Committee, as well as a couple other committees, Commerce, and this past session, I actually chaired the subcommittee on elections, which was a real interesting time to be chairing a committee on elections. For those of you who don't know me, I actually am a resident here in North Minneapolis, where I've called home for over the past 2 decades. But what brought me into elected office and service was I'm an impacted person. I actually had an offense back in the 70s, while our system was actually, I think, a little bit more amenable to folks with a little bit more programming for folks on the inside. Like many, I suffered from addiction, and ultimately the actions around my addiction led me to committing a burglary. I spent several months locked up before being released to go to drug treatment, and I'm happy to say that I've been clean and sober for the last 44 years. And ultimately in 1982, I received a pardon from the state of Minnesota. And that pardon allowed me to live my life as if I'd never committed an offense. And that's an unusual situation today. Back then, I think it may have been a little bit more common. I think that I think we need to allow individuals the opportunity to redeem themselves, and on the inside is one of those places where I think that that's critical for that to begin. I actually applied for a pardon because of I believe that I lost my right to vote forever, and I wanted to vote and participate in society as a contributing member and deciding who those elected officials would be. So I'm not naive enough to also understand that one of the reasons that I had many of these opportunities was because of the color of my skin. Being a white man in our criminal justice system, we know that the opportunities are very different than a lot of individuals that are people of color. We know that our prison system has expanded greatly since the 80s. To nearly 4 times the number of people that were incarcerated prior to that. So prisons are one of those places where individuals can have the chance to redirect their lives, or they can do time and get out and feel as though the world is not going to invest in them, and helping them to become the best persons that they can be. So that's a little background about me. I'm excited to be facilitating this discussion. We've got some great panelists, and I'm going to take this moment to tell them 4 to 5 minutes, introduce yourself, what you're working on, why it's important, and why you're excited to be here. So I'm going to start with Daniel Karpowitz. Daniel, if you could introduce yourself, tell folks about the role you're currently playing here in Minnesota and the work you've been doing within the correction system. Daniel, I think you're muted.
Thank you. Hello? We good?
Yep.
Great. So thank you, Ray. Thank you, Mariah and Paul, for doing this with me. And thanks to Justin and everyone at the Research Council. It's great to join you. I come to this work relatively recently to Minnesota, where I moved about 1.5 years ago from the East Coast, where I worked for about 20 years building partnerships, actually in a number of areas of criminal justice reform and civil rights, but primarily building partnerships between colleges and universities and men and women who were incarcerated and in their systems, to build that kind of pathways from inside prisons to the places that higher education in America can and often does move people. I am, for the last 1.5 years, been a colleague of Paul's at the Department of Corrections, where we're involved in a lot of systems change. This idea of what we call programming is central, I think, to the reorganization or changes that Paul will speak to. My role in part in that process is to advance, as part of our agency strategic plan and as part of the Walls Administration strategic plan, a really new generation of structural partnerships between higher education in Minnesota and people who are currently incarcerated and coming home from that, to make educational attainment and achievement and ambition and accomplishment central to the processes of healing, redemption, wealth creation, and building of themselves and of our cities and counties. So that's the broader vision of what that can do. By that idea of education is quite inclusive. It means career training, it means technical training. It also means the liberal arts and what we sometimes call, unfortunately, perhaps higher education. I wanted to share a few things about the vision beyond that in a moment that I have. The first part of the vision is that I think is that there's no such thing as correctional education. That term corrections has almost nothing to offer the word education. And that education, the things we expect from ourselves or from our family members and our communities from education, is really identical to what we expect that can and should do for people who are currently incarcerated or formerly incarcerated. I believe that there's really nothing the term corrections has to offer the term education. And in fact, it has a lot it can detract in terms of what expectations are set and how we measure success, both as people and as institutions. And hopefully that's a bit of a disruptive take on it. So the second thing I'd say is that what are we doing in lieu of that at the DOC? We're pursuing education in part with an idea of what's called inclusive excellence. And that's not a term from American corrections. It's not a term from law enforcement. It's not a term that takes recidivism as a benchmark of how teachers and students are doing. It's a standard term in American higher education on campuses around the country to understand what inclusion is, what equity is, and what the highest levels of creative, intellectual, and professional achievement are. And so we've just borrowed the language from American higher education at its best of inclusive excellence. I could speak more to the details, time permitting, but those of you who are familiar with how those concepts work, we could talk about how we're deploying them inside the correctional space or the prison space with our teachers and students. It's inclusive, and the goal is excellence. Finally, I'd last say the piece of the vision that we're bringing to this is we're not mandated primarily to build new programs. The future of education as a piece of comprehensive quote unquote programming in the DOC is not about, for us in education, building new programs. It's about new partnerships. It's partnerships with one of the great public university infrastructures in the country, the Minnesota State University system. It's about being in a state that has no private Research One university. It just has the U. And that means that those are our new partnerships that we're seeking to forge with our community colleges, our four-year state universities, and our research universities. This is Minnesota, and the men and women who are incarcerated have disappeared as relevant student populations for those great parts of our higher educational infrastructure. And our job is to put that connection back in its proper place. So those are the three pieces of the vision. I think I'll leave it there. There's a lot of practical activity going on, but I want to leave time for my colleagues and most importantly, conversation and Q&A. I'll only say that while COVID created massive disruptions to the agency and WALS administration's plans to implement these new partnerships between colleges, universities, two-year technical colleges, universities, and the U, we have not stopped. And in lieu of that, to build a bridge to the other side of COVID for higher education and education broadly at the DOC, we created something called the Open University. That created 270 new university level teaching and learning opportunities in our prisons in the dark of COVID over the course of this past spring and summer. And we are doubling that to nearly 500 opportunities across multiple prisons. And we are using every possible way to do that and build a bridge to higher university and college engagement in the darkest moments of COVID. So that's it for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. And Mariah, if you could give us a few minutes about yourself and why you're so excited to be working on these issues.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. So my name is Mariah Wilburn. I use she, her, hers pronouns. Before I get started, I just want to let you know I have a disorder that affects my vocal cords. So if my voice sounds a little bit shaky, that is why. Please don't let it be distracting. I am here in the capacity of a directly impacted person. I am formerly incarcerated, and my path to prison included running away from home at 17 and immediately becoming homeless, doing survival sex while I'm living on the streets for several years, just trying to take care of basic needs, which then led to an HIV diagnosis. I found out when I was pregnant. I was in very abusive relationships. I struggled with chemical health, and ultimately I was arrested for a first-degree drug sales for selling a cumulative 1/100th of a gram over the threshold weight to make it a first degree. I had never been in any significant trouble before. I did have a bounce check, and I had been on administrative probation before, but never supervision. And I ended up being sentenced to 54 months total. I did around 18 months between Shakopee Women's Prison and Togo, where I went to boot camp. While I was incarcerated, some of the services that I received were, I got my certificate in office support, and then I was actually able to apply to college and take the placement test. So I was all set to start school a month after going home. I did individual therapy, I did group therapy, I did cognitive behavioral therapy, I did chemical health treatment, writing workshops, health services. When I got to prison, I actually learned that my HIV had progressed to an AIDS diagnosis. I was 25 years old, and that was kind of a turning point for me to take care of my health and start to accept this diagnosis, because the stigma and the shame was a large part of the reason that I ended up incarcerated. I had a lot of transitions support while I was incarcerated. If you're living with HIV, you do get additional care during your re-entry process. You start to work with a case manager while you are still in the facility to make sure that you're all set to take care of your health when you leave the facility. And when I got to prison, I really thought, wow, I'm just a really messed up person. And, I did have a lot of things I needed to learn. I will say for sure, I didn't grow up with the tools I needed to kind of deal with life successfully. But I also came to a realization when I was there that, society failed me too. There's a lot of missed opportunities for intervention along my path to prison. And that is not unique to me. That's a story that's shared by every other person I was incarcerated with. So I got kind of mad, right? I said, wow, I want to do something to make sure these systems work better for people than they did for me. So I got out, and as I mentioned, I started school full-time, and I began a nonprofit career doing HIV education. And since then, I've been out almost 7 years. I've become a homeowner, a voter. I went from working for nonprofits to now working for state government, leading Minnesota's statewide plan to end HIV. And I started to realize, along this journey, that the systems actually worked really well for me as a white woman. And my felony conviction, my criminal history does not cancel out my white privilege. So I'm trying to make the systems work better for everyone, but especially, for communities that they've never worked well for. So yes, I will say that the most important, I think, service for me was the office support certificate, because that really rekindled my love of learning. And since getting out in 2013, I completed my associate's degree at MCTC. Then I completed my bachelor's degree at Metro State University. And then I just finished up a Master of Public Administration last December. So I'm really excited to be here, and some of the other ways that I am involved during normal times when it's safe. I'm a monthly motivational speaker at the Shakopee Women's Prison, and then I'm also a regular speaker at the Ramsey County Workhouse. I am the first formerly incarcerated person on the Ramsey County Corrections Advisory Board. And I also helped get the 2016 drug sentencing reform passed, which is where I met Representative Dehn. And that really kind of inspired my passion for macro work and led me to pursue a career at the state. So very excited for this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Mariah. Really appreciate your comments. And Commissioner Schnell, you're up next.
Good morning. Thanks to JRC and Mariah and Daniel and you, Representative Dehn. It's a pleasure to be here. I think what's interesting, I just want to highlight something that you said, Mariah, that you prison might be best described as the land of missed opportunities. And I think the question for me in this role is how do we address the issues of missed opportunities in an environment that while not ideal, reflects a reality of the system that we are in. And so one of the things that I'm appreciative of, and one of the things that I just really want to talk about really quickly that we're working on is really a shift, a fundamental shift in what we're doing and how we view people coming into the prison system, and ultimately what we hope will be the system. And right now today, when people come in, they go through some period of assessment, but ultimately what we want to do is really move to this notion of a person-centered focus. How do we make sure that our system addresses the needs and then associated risks that go along with those needs on an individual basis? Today, when people come into the system, they may end up having to fit into the programs and services that we offer versus the system, and this goes to the missed opportunities, the system making sure that it can and does address the needs of people that are coming into the system, that we think about the work we're doing as an individual experience, because ultimately these are people, these are human beings, and we want to make sure that we're addressing their needs. We have started an initiative where we are looking at converting our agency to this person-centered focus across the board. We are working on ways to do more comprehensive assessment, which is really just people who come into the system, allowing us to help them identify and refine a sense of both their strengths, their needs, their risks, and identification of how we build up their support systems, so that when they go back, there is the opportunity for true redemption. And we can talk more about this, but for me, this is not rocket science. This is really, I think, just making the system work better for people, no matter who you are. And I think if we do this and we do this right, and we make sure that we lift up the voice of the people that we're trying to serve, the people who come into the system, we will not only achieve better outcomes, but I think we'll do that with an eye toward being more equitable, fair, and humane in how we respond to people. I would just last say that, that the thing I love about Mariah's story is that I'm a person who's responsible for overseeing at some level the state's prisons, and there's a lot of people involved in this. And yet I oftentimes find prisons to be places of great sadness for me, because I do think it reflects society's missed opportunities. But I do think that there is the opportunity to create and have people experience the transformation that Mariah described for us. But we have to make sure that we're doing everything we can to lift that up. And so as we look at this person-centered approach, what we want to do is have a system that puts behind the people coming in and the work that needs to get done to transform their lives, or to address the needs that they may have, that we incentivize that. And we incentivize that through shifts and changes in early release, and even the potential for earlier discharge from some level of supervision. So this is a vision that ultimately we want to bring forward. We're actively trying to get input from people, both currently and formerly incarcerated, our staff, and people across the spectrum, family members, because ultimately, if we're going to build something that works, it has to be informed by the people who've been impacted by this system. And with that, I'll turn it back to you, Representative Dehn, and we can kick this off and go whatever direction people want to take this.
Great. Thank you, Commissioner, and thank all of you on the panel. I'd like to jump into questions. Are folks hearing me? Okay, just wanted to be sure. Jump into questions here right away, and hopefully we'll get through most of these, and maybe we'll have a chance for a few of questions from our audience. First question is, many people regard prison as a mechanism for ensuring public safety. What's your perspective on this view, and how might we reimagine prison? And why don't we go to similar to what we started? Daniel, if you'd like to jump in and grab that question first, and then we'll go to Mariah, and then wrap it up with you, Commissioner.
I would say I'll be very brief and really defer, I think, to my colleagues on the panel, who I think actually know a lot more about that question than I do. I'll say it seems clear that there is certainly some element of the prison that contributes to public safety. And whatever that degree is, it seems, at least my preoccupation is, where that our responsibility in public service is to be concerned about how the systems we've inherited are not living up to that mandate to contribute to public safety. And I do believe that the systems that we inherit are at times contributing to the problem rather than helping to ameliorate it. And that's the first point of our responsibility, is to think critically about that and assess ourselves accordingly. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Daniel. Mariah, would you like to jump in?
Yeah, so when I reimagine prison, I would like to see it as a last resort. Too often it is the first resort or the only resort because of those missed opportunities. So, and let's also look, I think with public programs, you can look, the funding tells you what our priorities are. So let's really use prison in a different way, fund more diversion programs, fund more supportive housing, fund more community-based programs. And then you can reduce the prison population. You have people getting services out in the community without the life disruption, without the collateral consequences of being a felon, right? Having a felony conviction. And then if you really only have the people that truly need to be there, you can focus your resources more effectively. Right now, there's so many people in prison that can't access any services because their sentence is too long. So what are they doing there? They're just existing. Let these people be out in the community getting the support they need there. So that's where I would start to reimagine prison, by really making sure we're only, incarcerating very few people. And after, the other avenues have been exhausted. Because if you compare us to the rest of the world, is our mass incarceration, problem making us safer? I don't think anyone would argue that it is.
I would just say, I agree that mass incarceration has not made us safer. In fact, in many cases, the policies that we've used, in fact, have increased the risk for many of the people that come into the system. In other words, we actually, the system itself is a mechanism of criminal genesis. We create more. And I think that's something that we have to both understand and work through. Look, I think that there are certainly people, I think, that need sometimes whatever you want to call it, a period of cooling off, of some level of separation, perhaps some incapacitation, because there is some very true and real risk and need that needs to be addressed. That said, I agree 100% with Mariah that ultimately we have to really think about how we invest these resources. And I do think that we would be better served by trying to maximize the community's effectiveness in terms of responding to the needs of people who are in the system, and trying to keep people out of it. I think, as I thought about this a little bit, I really think we don't have a good deal of clarity about what the role of prison is in our society. There certainly is a range of objectives, but is prison really about punishment? And as we all know, the problem is, for many people, there is no full and complete way for people to pay their debt to society. Because of collateral consequences, they end up paying forever. Do our prisons have the fundamental responsibility of rehabilitation? And yet what ends up happening is oftentimes we may provide rehabilitative services that people are responsive to in some cases, but can you really have rehabilitation without redemption, without the opportunity to be wholly and fully embraced and reintegrated? And then I guess the question becomes, what does the combination of that look like? When we have this bent toward punishment, I think this becomes a challenge. So I think as we ask this question about safety, and we ask the question about the extent to which prisons help us achieve any level of community or public safety, in part, I think it goes back to the core question of what is it that prisons are intended or should provide? And ultimately, how do we begin to measure that as we go forward? I think, as we look at even this model I talked about, this person-centered approach with some opportunities for incentivization, and that ultimately does and could and should, we hope, create a smaller system. And that smaller system could result in the ability of us to further invest in community-based resources that lifts up and provides services not only to the people who are in corrections, but to the community member, to community more broadly. And ultimately, we think that healthier communities will result in us being able to better address those opportunities for intervention that for so long have been missed and resulted in people ending up in our correctional facilities.
Thank you, Commissioner. And I would, I'd like to add some stuff to that, but I think I'm not going to, just because we have a few other questions, and I definitely would like to get to them. This next question kind of relates to what you were speaking to, Commissioner, about Minnesota is a rehabilitative state, not a penal state. But yet we know that over the past few decades, the budget for the correction system and programming inside the walls, prison walls in our state, has been greatly reduced, which makes everybody's job a little bit more difficult. And clearly those individuals that are currently residents in our correction facilities don't have a lot of those opportunities. And so this question sort of relates to that. And I'd like you also at some point to maybe talk about the issue around cost effectiveness of our system, because I think that many of these opportunities that would help individuals to be transformative may be actually more cost effective on the outside than on the inside. So can transformative change occur in a prison environment? And I'll open up to whoever wants to jump in and take that.
I can jump in. Absolutely, transformative change can occur inside prison, but I think that often it's occurring in spite of the incarceration, not because of it, right? Because I think a lot of the transformative change, it's about meeting the needs of people. When I was incarcerated, the room I had in the Novello housing unit for 10 months was the longest I had ever lived one place in my adult life since running away from home at 17, and I'm 25 by this time. So housing was transformative for me. So I think, yes, transformative change can occur, but let's not say it's because of prison. It's because people are getting the services they need to live their best life. And I would also say that there's just never enough to go around. So there's a lot of people that might want to change, but because of a short sentence or because programs are full, they might not have access to get the tools they need to change, like I was fortunate enough to do.
And I would agree. I do think that there is an opportunity, and I think we should seize the opportunity as much as possible. I think we should incentivize people to make those investments in themselves, because at the end of the day, it's good for them. It is good for us. It addresses the needs, and I think it strengthens the opportunity for full reintegration and ultimately redemption. So yes, I believe that they can be. I believe that we have to begin to think differently about what prisons are. I think you talked about the Representative Dehn about the whole notion of are we more rehabilitative or punitive? And I think over the course of time, as we've seen, even our incarceration rates in our state go up, though we're among the lowest in the country. I think we have seen a shift, and many of our colleagues have talked about the fact that even in their careers, they talked about the differences in the way staff have related to them and the way services were offered in our prisons. Many people talked about how staff used to be heavily involved and with the incarcerated folks, that families used to have barbecues, as in fact on the grounds at Stillwater. And this is not 200 years ago. We're talking about these are things that occurred in 30 years ago. And so I think this whole notion of how do we begin to recognize the humanity of people, and how do we find ways to help incentivize that, and lift up and support that, and really create, as Daniel talked about, the pathways in higher education. I think we need to create the pathways between prison and community. And sometimes there has been challenges there because people may come out and may not have support systems for a whole host of reasons. And we need to make sure that we're working and helping people develop that prior to leaving our facilities, to make sure that there's adequate supports to lift up the efforts that they've made while they were in. And I think lastly, I would just say that as we look at some of the issues, Mariah had mentioned this, that sometimes people can't access services when they come in. One of the big changes that we're looking at with this person-centered approach is to front-end load services versus back-end load services. Today, you may not access treatment programming until very close to in the last year of your incarceration. We want that to shift. We want services based upon need and risk and what the person believes is going to be most beneficial to helping them be successful in the community. We want those services to be offered more upfront, and then build support around that. And then make sure that there are pathways, whether it's education or whether it is treatment or substance use supports, mental health supports, whatever it may look like in the community, to maximize the likelihood of success.
And Daniel, could you speak to this question?
I guess I'd just begin by repeating something that's been, I think, said and often implied. There is a tremendous amount of success that individuals have found and created for themselves under tragic circumstances. And often, as Mariah points out, they point out really our failures prior to reach out and make connections and sustain and invest in a way that is humane and really genuinely does produce public safety, so that prison, which is our most toxic intervention, is an intervention of the last resort, which all too often not. And to acknowledge and celebrate the obvious and many, many cases in which the answer presents itself to the question, of course, as Mariah points out. I don't know if this is the time to respond to some issues in the chat about Ray, but I'll just flag that there's some pretty pointed questions or points of view about education, and whenever it's timely, I'd love to be able to respond.
Actually, Daniel, this is sort of a good time for a few of the questions in our Q&A and in our chat. And it sort of speaks about what are the current plans for changes in the system, and specifically, some issues around higher education for those individuals that are currently residing in our correctional facilities. So if you want to start on that, Daniel, and then Commissioner, if you could jump in and do some follow-up on some of the changes that are currently in the pipeline. I'm sure that not all of them are actually been met yet, but at least give folks opportunity to get a sense of some of the things that you're all talking about and thinking about.
Great. Thanks, Ray. I'll do that. And I'll just forward to where Paul was going and what he just a moment ago emphasized. The education at all levels, from most basic adult education to the highest levels of education that Minnesota excels at, are all an important part of creating a truly person-centered prison system in Minnesota, and one that reconnects people to their communities. I obviously have seen for decades, and I believe some of the conversations we've had indicate just how precious and important campuses, which are built across our state, can be to helping people return, find redemption, and reach their full capacity and contribute in all sorts of ways: civic, intellectual, creative, political. intellectual. And so I believe the college and university systems are a crucial part, by no means comprehensive, but a crucial part of that reconnection to community that needs to happen more in advance in life, and certainly inside our systems and throughout. I'd just like to respond to some of the comments. It is true, Minnesota does a great job at certain elements of education inside the prison system, among the best in the country, in particular in adult basic education, GED, secondary credentials. But to rest on those laurels is unacceptable because it belies the facts. The data are, I think, surprising to many people that the vast majority of people in Minnesotan prisons already have a secondary credential. 75% roughly of men and women who are currently incarcerated are completed a secondary credential, which means that they are eligible for Minnesota post-secondary and higher education. And we're not meeting that need at all. And so our current distribution of revenue does not meet the need. And I think it's a very interesting question we could take up later. Why doesn't it? The answer to fixing that involves a lot of the structural change Paul has alluded to in the agency, front loading, but also really recentering around needs and holding ourselves accountable as elements of the system to honestly identifying and courageously and ambitiously meeting those needs and capacities. I will say to me, I will just say that the central part of the vision is, again, just simply recognizing the thousands of people who are, for whom becoming students in the system is their logical part of their next step in life, and that our public institutions have not yet seen that and embraced it. So our vision is simply to make the prison spaces and the men and women inside them and in transit through them, students, seen as students and met as potential students in the system. It's really, it is, again, for, as Paul said, it's actually not rocket science. And we have models from other states to emulate, and we have a Minnesota model to create on our own.
I would just say, you know, that I truly believe that one of the things that Daniel kind of referenced, and I guess maybe I've said more subtly than I should, is that ultimately what we're trying to do with this person-centered model is really begin to put probably a bit more of the onus on opportunities for transformation and providing those opportunities on the system, as opposed to today on the individual. Certainly, we know that there has to be a level of individual commitment, and I think Mariah did a great job of talking about there were things that she came to realize as a result of being where she was, and gained some insights into that. I think, and I've heard that from many people over the course of my time here. But I also think that you know, we have to, that by changing this whole notion of the way we think about how we bring people, how we orient people, what we learn from them, how we ultimately better serve them, and how we lift up their voice in this process to have better outcomes, I think becomes really essential, and puts the responsibility for that more on us, where I believe it should be. The system should address and make sure that the services are being provided meet the needs of these individuals, and that we really have a sense of what are the current gaps that may exist in those services. What are the you know, are we culturally responsive? Making sure that, you know, that we're not expecting people to fit into the one treatment option that we offer if we know that people are not as responsive to that model. So I think for me and for us, we're trying to create a level of system accountability that we think will not only serve the kind of the broad interest of Minnesota in the broadest sense, make our community safer, you know, provide a level of confidence to people who've been harmed by crime in our communities, that the system is really invested in trying to make sure that these things don't happen again by investing in people, and ultimately to do everything we can to see and help the individuals that we ultimately serve be their best and have the opportunity for full community reintegration. That really is at the end of the day the thing. And I always think about the fact that when we start to look at two people come into the system the same day with the same sentence. One deeply invests in taking advantage of the opportunities, whether it's education, whether it's addressing healthcare needs, whether it is substance use treatment, the myriad of spiritual or faith-based programs that people can access if they choose, and even many of the programs that are incarcerated person-led within the facilities. If somebody takes advantage of that and the next person says, I'm not going to do anything but just sit here and do my time, that ultimately I think, how do we create opportunities to really help that person, to incentivize that person to continue and maintain that level of investment in themselves and seeing that future, and hopefully encouraging those who may be resistant to that to see the opportunity that can come from a deeper investment in self, and also seeing the fact that the system is invested in people's success. And that's really the key shift, the key paradigm notion of the shift for us as a system that ultimately I think will deliver better and be more cost effective for people in the community and the folks we serve.
Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. And I'm going to ask Mariah to respond to a question directly that was asked in from the Zoom chat.
Yeah. Yes, thank you. Before I do that, I just wanted to say to Commissioner Schnell, how do we get those people motivated to want to take advantage of those opportunities? Peers, right? Seeing people who have been there, been in prison, done their time and got out and did well. That's what's going to help motivate people. And there's not enough of that programming during incarceration of people coming back and saying, I've been there. You have a lot of information flying at you and you don't really know what's important, what's not important. But if you have someone that has been through it talking to you, that's going to just make a deeper connection that someone who hasn't experienced incarceration just might not be able to get through to that person. So I would say peers are underutilized. And then to piggyback off of that, there was a question in the chat from Kate about what key components were most helpful to me when preparing for release and during my transition, what was harmful or not helpful, but the system may have assumed it would be. So thank you for that question. I would say the most helpful thing for me was cognitive skills therapy and understanding just because I thought something didn't mean it was true, and that I had the power to look at what I was thinking and choose more helpful thoughts. So for me, that was truly transformative because I had never learned to question my thoughts. How many of us do learn to do that unless there's a problem? Going home into the community, really, I was lucky to be living with HIV and to be ready to deal with that because I really quickly became involved in doing volunteer HIV education. And I found an entire community of supportive folks waiting for me, waiting to love me, waiting to support me, waiting to relate to me, also going to Breaking Free to deal with some of the issues I had from my time doing survival sex and some of the shame and guilt I carried around. So it was really about community support, lifting me up and holding me. And then what was not helpful? Commissioner Schnell alluded to needing different treatment options for people. And I don't know if we're ready yet, but I think we need to have the conversation about harm reduction more in the correction system. There is no one size fits all approach to being well. And, I really look up to Representative Dehn and I'm so proud. And he has been, clean and sober for decades now. But I do want to say not every single person who has struggled with substance use needs, not every approach will work with that person. So what are we doing about harm reduction? How are we supporting people? People who leave incarceration in the first 2 weeks are 78 times more likely to die of a heroin overdose and 40 times more likely to die of any opiate-induced overdose in the 2 weeks leaving incarceration. And that risk remains elevated a year later. Are we having conversations about harm reduction? I saw someone put in the chat, we need to have medication-assisted treatment in the facilities. Absolutely. That's how we're really going to serve people well. We can't tell everyone that sobriety, complete absence from all substances is the only path for you to be well. Because then when a person says, you know what, I don't feel like this is right, are they going to just go back into chaotic drug use? I am, sometimes a model, I did well on parole. I was never violated. I was never sanctioned. But I will tell you a secret. I am a person who had a very chaotic drug use for many years of my life, but I am not a person who requires complete sobriety to live my best life and to be in recovery. So does the fact that I am a social weekend drinker somehow negate my progress? If I would have been caught drinking on the weekends while I was on parole, would I have went from this amazing success story to someone who failed? As we, collectively move towards treating drug use as the public health issue it is, and not the moral failing or the criminal issue that we know it's not, we need to also look to public health to say what's the most effective way to deal with this, and that's harm reduction. Back to you.
Thank you, Mariah. You raise a critical issue, and I think it's important that we do look at this notion of harm reduction. What does that mean? As someone who's been in recovery a long time, I don't expect everyone else to recover in the same way that I have. And, there are individuals that have abused that maybe haven't crossed over into an addiction. And that's a hard line to define. And ultimately, individual that's leading their best life is what we want to get to in the end. We've probably only got about another 6 or 7 minutes here. But, Commissioner Schnell, you had spoken to the issue about looking at issues around treating substance abuse earlier on in an individual sentence versus towards when they're ready to get out. And as we think about oftentimes the amount of time individuals have in their sentence being locked up inside the correctional facility, can you talk about ways of, one, addressing the addiction earlier, and then 2, what does the handoff look like for those individuals who may only be in there for 120 days or something like that? If you could speak to that, that'd be great.
Yeah, I think that's a key question, and many people have asked that as we start to think about the front end loading of services. I would just say that we need to make sure that there are kind of adequate support systems and on an ongoing basis. And let's be clear, I think there is a very strong and committed community of recovery that exists within our facilities. It's certainly not everybody, but there is a community there. And I think we can begin to do that. I think we have to look at, and we are doing medication assisted treatment today, and looking at a variety of different types of medication options related to that. I think we have looked at, not everybody goes out into the community with the same conditions. So it's not everybody gets a no use condition. So I agree that these are things that we do need to look at, make sure we implement. To the whole question of, how do you do that when you have people who have varying different times? I think this is one of the things that we need to manage. I think doing these more thorough assessments will help us better understand our capacity to meet people's needs and really be aware of how we're going to manage that. But it goes to oftentimes to the primacy of need. And I think the people we serve ultimately will know some of this best. You can look at and hear in the voice of people, many of them saying, look, you know, my addiction issues, it got me here. It got me into this place in a significant way. And it reminds me a little bit of this whole notion of, you know, we talk about, you know, we have to address people's needs, but we're going to make sure that, you know, we're going to get you into that adult basic ed because you don't have your diploma or your GED, but you have a really horrible toothache. You know, to me, how do you begin to look at the primacy of need? If you have somebody that's in pain with a toothache, that needs to be prioritized and immediately addressed so that they can more fully engage and participate in the things that other things that can enrich them, whether it's cognitive behavioral programming or education or substance use treatment. We have to begin to think about this in terms of kind of what are the first bites of that apple. And frankly, you know, we can help folks talk through that stuff, but the people we serve ultimately, I do believe, know these things, and if they can be honestly and truthfully engaged in that and know that the system is there to support them in terms of achieving their objectives and which are ultimately the objectives of the community and should be the objectives of the system, then you know, then I do believe that we can identify what the primacy of need is and develop a schedule and get people through that. If people are very short in terms of time, you know, I think the period of time that they spend with us should be focused on how are they going to get what they need in the community? Who and where is that going to happen? And ultimately, I think this becomes it has to become the priority, primacy of need, and what is going to achieve the biggest bang for the buck for them, and that's going to need to come from them. I want to talk about, there are a lot of things in the system that I think need to be changed and thought about. I look at some of the comments and the cost for programs and services and those sorts of things, the racial disparities that are profound and distinct, and I want to be really clear that as we look at this person-centered approach, this whole notion of the equity model is something that we really want to be and will be built into this, because we think that that's essential. And no doubt that structurally and systemically there are considerable changes that need to happen. And these things are we need the input, the suggestions, the ideas of people to come together and partner with us to help us as we go into legislative sessions to talk about what the system changes should look like. And ultimately, the criminal justice system is, for lack of a better word, I guess, the way of calling it, but is a public system and something that demands the voices. And I know somebody talked a little bit about the Second Chance Coalition. I would just really encourage people to engage there. I think they're really calling for and creating accountability for us as we go about this work. And ultimately, we're here as public servants and to make to be more effective, and that's and we need people's help in terms of achieving that.
Thank you, Commissioner. We're pushing up against our time here. I'd like Daniel to say a couple words in closing, and Mariah, and then I'll come and close us out. So, Daniel.
Yep, I'll just end by saying I think in the spirit of a lot that's been shared, as we identify needs, we need to be centered around capacities. And if we begin with low expectations, we will fail to meet people with their tremendous talents and energies and potential that they bring to us. And I think that's what defines the best of education in the United States. And if we're not replicating that behind prison walls and with students there, we're disserving ourselves and the humanity of and genius of our students. So I'm excited about the direction we're moving in, and look forward to working actually with you all and on how we put this into place.
Mariah, briefly.
Yeah, I think in closing, when I reimagine prison and services, I reimagine, we've talked a lot about how we as the public sector have failed people. So I would like to see the public sector doing more to step up and make this right. And I would love to see things like when people leave with these office support certificates, this IT training, why aren't they going straight into an internship program with the state, with the county? Why can't we make virtual programs where people can actually still be working and learning inside facilities, but reaching out and getting professional skills and connecting with future employers? I would love to see amazing programming like that. So thank you. I know we're out of time.
Yeah, thank you, Mariah. We are out of time. We probably should have had a 90-minute or longer session, but a lot to get to, a lot to be said. I want to, of course, thank the panelists and thank all the attendees for fielding us some great questions. And I guess it's time for everybody to go back to the main session. So thank you all.